So when you look at Palestine and you look at the Israeli occupation, you look at the checkpoints, you look at the money, the funding, you look at birthright trips, you look at all these seemingly independent elements of an entire apparatus, and yet they're all connected to the same source. Tommy Robinson famously has had support from billionaires in the US. If this is a common Englishman fighting for, the white working class, then why is his support not necessarily coming from those people here in the millions? Billionaires and millionaires and other wealthy-to-do people who fund and support trips for people from, the USA, from the UK to travel to Israel to have the opportunity to naturalize there as citizens, which isn't afforded to Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 or 1967 or in 2006, 2003, 2024. I think all these examples show throughout history that when you can get to the point of describing people as cockroaches or human animals or super predators or scum or vermin or urban, then it allows for a certain treatment that treats people as subhuman. 17 billion pounds in today's money paid in reparations to the slave owner. That doesn't feature in very many history textbooks.
Our guest today is a Mancunian social justice activist who does a lot of community work and has been extremely vocal on Palestine, especially in the last few months. Welcome, Nova.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
You can call me Yiz, actually. That's the abbreviated name I go by these days. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, Yiz.
Thank you.
I'd like to start at the beginning, kind of what, maybe growing up, or what did you see around you in Manchester that influenced how you do your work today and influence kind of how vocal you are on Palestine specifically?
Well, you see, Manchester's a very interesting city. I often talk about, say, the street where I grew up. It's called Ward Street. It's in Hume. It's right next to this area called Moss Side, which is known for having a certain mix of both ethnic, racial diversity, but all within a sort of working class environment where people pool their resources together. I had, white uncles, Ugandan aunties, this kind of thing. And growing up in that sort of environment where people take care of each other, that was a very big impression that was left on me. And then I also connect that to my roots back in Ghana, where both my grandmothers were bakers. And as bakers in Ghana, they had this role where they sort of anchored their communities. People could go to my grandmother's house for bread, yes, but at the same time, they could go for, help, advice, assistance, and this kind of thing. And I think that's left a lasting impression on me. I think as I've gotten older, I've experienced, if you like, the elements of Manchester that are sort of at odds. They're juxtaposed with the sort of spirit or character of that working class solidarity. Like, one of the things I love about Manchester is when you go there, one, it's a bit slower paced than London, which I appreciate, but also the people there are like friendly, they're kind, so you can strike up a conversation with anybody on the street and they'll have some time for you, especially if you have a problem. And I think all that's left an impression on me.
So you experience what some would call quite a bit of multiculturalism, right? And how would you say these different aspects of different cultures played into your life growing up in Manchester?
I think the thing that it left me with more than anything is radical empathy, in that people think of empathy as just, something here and there that you practice every so often. But I saw it on a day-to-day basis where, somebody's car breaks down, everybody's coming out to push the car up a hill or down this road or wherever it is. People are going to share whatever they have at any point if anybody needs something. And people also have stories to tell, people who are refugees, who are asylum seekers, who have come from different corners of the world, and they all have a story to tell. And I think growing up, that sort of gave me an appreciation, not just for different people's cultures, but also for different people just as they are, in that you don't have to believe the same things as I do. You don't have to think the same way as I do, but I respect you and love you as a human being. And I think that is very much a Mancunian thing.
Brilliant. And you're quite vocal on Palestine as well as other issues. I'd like to get to Palestine specifically maybe a little bit later, but what caused you to become this vocal about social justice?
Well, two things in that, my father's a preacher, so social justice, if you like, is part of his DNA. And I talked about my grandmothers who were also vocal and in their own ways practiced a form of, collective welfare, of what David Graeber would describe as everyday communism, the idea that is each according, to their needs, and from each according to what they can provide. And I saw that on a regular basis growing up. I think if two events, so there was the execution of George Floyd in 2020 that especially aggravated me, because for many young black people, it made them reflect on their experiences with not just the justice system at the hard end with the police, but experiences in school and experiences on the street or in shops, the various different things that you don't necessarily recognize at the time that they're happening, especially if you're young. But once you get older and you have a framework for talking about that stuff and dealing with that stuff, then it becomes more apparent and it becomes more accessible when you have a vocabulary to describe what has happened to you for all those years. And then when it comes to Palestine, I think my first experience was with a sort of boycott Puma situation on university campuses. I went to LSE and there was a big push at the time to talk about apartheid. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and other bodies came out in the sort of late 2010s, 2020s to discuss this idea of what the Israeli government does to Palestinians broadly as apartheid in a sense, but in a different sense to the way that it's been used to describe what happened in South Africa. So I think that event, and then going to rallies and marches, particularly Albert Systems, had a factory in Oldham, and that also became a place for me to grow and develop as a commentator and as an activist. I went from, writing down every single word on a speech that I was going to give to people from Oldham who were angry, like I was, about having an arms factory in their backyard that was manufacturing the same material that's used to tear limbs from limb in Gaza, in the West Bank, but not just there. This kind of arms exported all over the world. And I think people were angry about that because, Oldham, like Mossad, like Hume, is also a very multicultural area. It's also a place where there's a lot of working class solidarity. So I think those are the places I sort of cut my teeth, and that's sort of how I went from A to B.
Right. And with Palestine, would you say there's a specific event, apart from the boycotts that you saw happening around you, a specific event that happened over there that made you feel some of that radical empathy you were speaking about earlier?
I think there's multiple moments. Unfortunately, there's too many to name. But a specific thing that stuck out when you said that was Shireen Abu Akleh, who was assassinated. She had the press jacket on and so on and so forth. And my mother studied journalism at university. And she never went on to practice in a day-to-day way, but that sort of approach. There's a quote: "The idea that journalism is supposed to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted." I think that really sort of played out in a very visceral way when you saw a journalist for Al Jazeera being shot. And when you ask yourself, so this is a question I tend to ask myself quite a lot when it comes to these different situations, because I still think you need to test. Because a lot of people who don't have the same experiences as you tend to look at things very differently. And so when somebody looks at that and they just see, oh, it was an accident or it was a mistake or this kind of thing, it's the question of, if it wasn't for X or Y characteristics, or if it had happened in a different situation, would the result still have been the same? And Israeli journalists don't get shot in the head, in the heart that way. British journalists don't get shot at that way. American journalists don't get shot at that way. And I think her treatment and the way that it was, spun away as, oh, this was at first, it was a Palestinian bullet.
Yeah.
That sort of approach to things, that sort of devaluation of life.
Yeah.
I think when you look at the specific characteristics and you look at the pattern, then it becomes clear that this was not just because, they were a journalist. This is because she was a Palestinian.
Yeah.
And I think that resonated with me quite strongly. But, that was only, 2 years ago? And since then, there have been more journalists killed in Gaza than in the entirety of, World War II.
Yeah.
And that's specific to a place and it's specific to a people.
Yeah, and we saw this dehumanization with her specifically, as even after she was killed. The Israeli police attacked pallbearers, causing her casket to drop. And, this kind of dehumanization really speaks to the systems of power at play. And I'd like to actually touch on, how do you think these systems kind of coincide with the systems we see here? I mean, the Palestinian cause has resonated with so many people all over the world. And many people would say that Palestine is actually a lot more connected than people may first seem or think.
Yeah. In Manchester, near the train station, there's this great like piece on a building, and it says everything is connected, and that's a very big part of my philosophy. Because I believe in God, but outside of that, I also believe that we're all from the same source. We all share the same DNA. We all breathe the same air. We all bleed, and we're all gonna die one day.
Yeah.
And so at the core of my philosophy is this idea that we're all very much connected. So when I think at first, when I was younger, when I was coming up through the educational system here, in many ways you're taught to think of your situation as your situation. It's whether or not you do well in your GCSEs and your A levels. It's about whether or not you and your family get money, whether or not you have a nice car, whether or not you have, a good salary. But more and more, I think you tend to be able to see how your life is very much dependent on other people's lives. As an example, to paraphrase, Kwame Ture, previously known as Stokely Carmichael, gives an example of the human baby in the forest, which I love for various reasons. But he gives the example of, the monkey, the baby monkey in the forest, even absent fellow monkeys, is likely to still, grow to maturity and survive. The same thing with a baby wolf. But when it comes to the human baby, it's a very different situation. The baby might scratch itself to death. It might crawl off a cliff. It will probably starve to death within a couple of days. And the difference between the human baby and these other animals is that human beings are so dependent from the cradle to the grave on what other human beings do. There's nothing that we do under the sun that somebody else didn't help us with, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, a cousin, a friend. Everybody, needs a helping hand. The Bill Withers song is, everybody needs somebody to lean on.
Yeah.
And so when you look at Palestine and you look at the Israeli occupation, you look at the checkpoints, you look at the money, the funding, you look at birthright trips, you look at all these seemingly independent elements of an entire apparatus, and yet they're all connected to the same source. And then when you dig deeper and you see the way that there are national funds, say, in the UK, where there are billionaires and millionaires and other wealthy to-do people who fund and support trips for people from, the USA, from the UK, to travel to Israel, to have the opportunity to naturalize there as citizens, which isn't afforded to Palestinians who were ethnically cleansed in 1948 or 1967 or in 2006, 2003, 2024. Those same rights aren't afforded to Palestinians, but they're afforded to people of Jewish heritage and descent in the UK and the US. And that's connected here. It's connected in the way that, say, Labour Friends of Israel or Conservative Friends of Israel, both political groups in the UK, but also receive support. Many of them have opaque funding structures and yet have been linked to various pro-Israel business people. And many politicians say in the US, they don't get the same success if they don't have the financial backing of AIPAC.
Yeah. So it's with Jamal Bowman.
Exactly. And so there's a financial infrastructure there, but then there's also a cultural infrastructure. A lot of work that I've done is with the Youth Front for Palestine in Manchester, and say an NGO, which typically, is seen as a sort of neutral entity. It's just there to foster good relations. It's a charity, but take solutions, not sides. It has various former Israeli officials, people with sometimes military experience who go into schools and propagate a particular version of history. Now, some would say that there's nothing wrong with, somebody's own spin of history, but the difficulty that you have is often to say children, people who are impressionable, and there's no Palestinian grounded reality or alternative that says, oh, this isn't true or that isn't true. And the way that it's presented goes a long way to explaining how a lot of people arrive at this sort of separate but equal narrative that, it's two equal sides, that these are two people with the same legitimate claim to the land. Yeah. They have, everything is the same, and it's just a dispute, say, over territory. And so there's this smoothing, this reductionist approach to history that happens not just with the Palestinian issue, but with various issues. If you take, say, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, in UK textbooks in history is often spoken of as William Wilberforce, a couple of other exceptional Caucasian individuals with a certain amount of wealth who could speak eloquently and who had connections, the ones who ended the slave trade. But the slave trade didn't end in the British Empire in 1807 or in 1833. It took many years for that to end, and it was part due to slave rebellion, say, in Haiti and elsewhere. But all of that is usually consigned to an addendum, a footnote. But I've sort of drifted off a bit. But when we come back to that idea that everything's connected, I think it starts first with the fact that we're all human beings. And secondly, as Kwame Ture said, that everything that we do is dependent on other human beings. You know, what is strength absent somebody to compare it to? What is wealth absent some other person who is considered to be wealthy or considered to be poor? All of this stuff is based on comparison, and all of that is based on the fact that we're all connected to each other. And so the system of oppression that sees a Palestinian life as less valuable, you know, when Yoav Gallant, the defense minister in Israel, talks about how, you know, human animals, how we're going to cut off all these things which are protected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that same sort of logic which says, you know, you're fighting human animals. If you look throughout history, the Rwandan genocide, what did they describe the Tutsis as? It was cockroaches. Yeah. Or when you see in the UK, a very popular sign, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Yeah. And you see how the human being is dragged from whatever they're born as, you know. Everywhere a man is born, you know, free. And yet everywhere they're in chains, to paraphrase Thomas Paine. So in that same way, you see that strange way that depending on the political circumstance, the economic circumstance, that often the most powerful groups in society, I watched recently the trial of the Chicago 7, say, but then I also watched When They See Us, and that follows the Central Park 5, young black boys who were seen to have committed rape in the eyes of the public. Donald Trump had taken out full-page ads in a newspaper and wanted to push for the death penalty. And all of a sudden, these boys, you know, in the same way Hillary Clinton referred to people in inner city as super predators, often it's in the language, but even worse than that, it's in the policies. So if you cut off Palestinians' food, water, and clothing in the UK, say, in a moment of crisis, take the 2011 London riots, Keir Starmer, others in the CPS, David Cameron put pressure, night courts, rapid processing, concerns about due process. And the question is, if the people in the demographics who were rioting, working class people, young black boys who were angry about the fact that a man had been assassinated in broad daylight, Mark Duggan, if it had been a different group, with Shireen Abu Akleh, a journalist, Palestinian journalist, if it had been a different group or a different person, would the result have been the same? And I think all these examples show throughout history that when you can get to the point of describing people as cockroaches or human animals or super predators or scum or vermin or urban, then it allows for a certain treatment that treats people as subhuman. You know, how did Hitler describe the Jews in Nazi Germany? How did Stalin describe certain, you know, undesirables within the Soviet Union? There are hundreds and hundreds of examples of how human beings can be taken from the place that they are, free and equal, and dragged down to a place where they're categorized as subhuman. And when you do that, through language often first, and then through policy, but sometimes it's policy and then the language just smooths it over on top, you can justify a wide range of inhuman treatments towards human beings.
Right. You mentioned there a few focal points maybe to do with the American experience, the African-American experience. And a lot of the times when we speak about racism, we, maybe because of media and whatnot, we point to the African-American experience. Do you feel like the experience in the UK is connected in a strong way? Do you feel like it's got its own unique aspects as well, that may be even worse?
I think, well, as we were talking about before, if everything is connected, then of course the Black British experience is also connected to the Black American experience in many ways. Let's take, say, police brutality. Many police forces exchange ideas and conversations with each other about tactics and how to, you know, perform arrests and how to police people. And the UK police at various times have engaged with different departments in the US, around the world, about tactics. So take, for example, the other day, Manchester Airport, a young man, whatever the context, whatever the situation, he's in the prone position.
Yep.
He is subdued. He's seemingly been tasered as well. And a response of an officer, serving member of a public body that you and I pay taxes to, is to stamp on his head and to kick him. Now, some might say, okay, what does that have to do with the African American experience? Or why do people look to Black America and the iconography, the Black Power fist and all these moments, say, in history, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and say, what's the connection there? Malcolm X once famously said that they don't oppress us because we are Baptist, or they don't oppress us because necessarily at that time because they were Muslim, but that they attacked us because we were Black. And the same way that Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck for over 7 minutes, you can see the very similar iconography here in the UK, a police officer stamping and kicking somebody in the head, and there in America, a white police officer kneeling on somebody's neck until the life drained out of his body. So this disproportionate use of force and violence against Black and brown bodies is not just specific to America. It's seen in the UK too. The difference being that because of things like the civil rights struggle, because of America's position both geographically, militarily, culturally, a lot of the frameworks that people use to understand oppression have their roots in many ways in that Black American experience. Because, if you like, African Americans, most of whom are there only because of the transatlantic slave trade, where millions of people died as a result, that becomes the sort of hard line, the sharp edge of oppression. And because of America's ability to, manufacture movies, Selma, Malcolm X by Spike Lee, and other such cultural moments, people are able to hang onto that iconography in a way and sometimes draw strength from it. But at times it can be reductive. At times it is specific to the Black African American experience in a way that it isn't here. And what are the ways that it's different? Well, for starters, in that Manchester Airport example, we're talking about a young, seemingly Asian, likely demographically to be a young Muslim male. And in the UK, with the rise of people like Tommy Robinson, with Nigel Farage, you can see, yes, there's Islamophobia in the US, but it doesn't seem to be a focal point in the same way that it is in the UK, at least at this particular moment in time, where it has also been exacerbated as a result of the Israeli government's actions in Gaza and in the West Bank and Jenin and so on and so forth. So Islamophobia also has an added element here. Secondly, the British relationship with other peoples is different. So the oppression of Ireland, say, features into what people would describe under the rubric of political blackness. At one point during the 60s and 70s and 80s, even people of South Asian heritage here were referred to in the same way that Black people were, because there was a general approach of the British establishment, of the British government, towards people from Commonwealth countries. Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech talks about the Black man at some point holding the whip over the white man. Right. And that in many ways referred to not just Black people Black British wasn't a thing at the time, but it also refers to South Asians. It also refers to people coming from the Caribbean. It refers to a wide range of people coming from the formerly subjugated nations who have come to the UK now. And so there is a unique element in the way that treatment blends over in ways that it doesn't necessarily in America.
You spoke briefly about Tommy Robinson. Now, Tommy Robinson is a very interesting phenomenon here in the UK. He presents himself as this working class white Englishman who cares about other working class white Englishmen. And at the same time, he spends his days in Marbella or the south of Spain or wherever he is. And he has a lot of interesting connections with a lot of very rich right-wing kind of donors. And you were actually attending and speaking at a protest against Tommy Robinson. So I'd like you, if you could kind of take us a bit through who Tommy Robinson is, what kind of effect he's had on British political discourse, and what you guys are doing tomorrow.
So my sister and mother often like to repeat to me that there's a lot of power in a name. And Tommy Robinson's real name is, of course, Stephen Yaxley Lennon. And, well, one has to wonder for his career, if we can call it that, why he's had to change his name.
Yeah.
And it's a similar question to why Rishi Sunak, when he was running for the election, felt the need to, drive a car and refer to Thatcher so much and make himself in that mold. Or why people like Rishi Sunak or Suella Braverman or Priti Patel and Kemi Badenoch seem to take such a hard line and hard stance on immigration, despite the fact that it was under Conservative government, say, we're talking Harold Macmillan, Winston Churchill, that up until the 70s, anybody from a Commonwealth nation could just come. No passport, no visa check needed. You could just come to the UK, especially because it was necessary for material conditions after the Second World War. And so why do all these people have to seemingly change these elements about themselves? Why does Tommy Robinson need to go by that name? Well, Tommy, in the First World War, the Second World War, was a common way to refer to the archetypical British soldier.
Yeah.
And so in that name, you can see already that Stephen Yaxley Lennon wants to identify himself with a certain conception of what it means to be British. In this case, it's the British soldier. It is the strong Englishman of good stock who is fighting to protect his land, his country, his nation. And unfortunately, that tendency to romanticize history has a pitfall in that it also tends to miss out all the elements of history that were bad.
Right.
And it tends to smoothen over anything that is difficult or inexplicable to this sort of framework that sees and projects English as good and therefore must necessarily project everything that is not English as not so good. So you see it, for example, in part of my research, in tons of posts referring to, ironically, how diversity is a strength, and they'll pick strange examples of people doing odd or wrong things and use that to paint a picture broadly of the immigrant, second, first, third generation immigrant population here in the UK. And that goes back to this thing of what does it mean to be English? So if you're identifying yourself, say, with the English soldier archetype, if your politics has to be one where you demonize and villainize migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and also refer to their culture as backwards, as uncivilized, as in the case of Muslims and those who identify with the religion of Islam as evil, as wrong, and as backwards, then I think it tells us a lot about how people like Tommy Robinson, how people like Suella Braverman, how people like Rishi Sunak, how people like Nigel Farage identify with Englishness, and how often they want to shape it towards their own ends. And what that shaping part is where the influences come in. Rishi Sunak didn't rise to the top without a serious amount of capital from people from a particular background. Tommy Robinson famously has had support from billionaires in the US. If this is a common Englishman fighting for, the white working class, then why is his support not necessarily coming from those people here in the millions, in the UK, in Manchester, in Leeds, in London? And why does it have to come from billionaires who want to propagate a certain vision of the world?
Yeah, and whose interests are diametrically opposed to the working Englishman.
Exactly. Because take Rishi Sunak, for example, a man who was a big proponent of something that they describe as free ports, entire zones, economic zones where the working standards could be lowered, where the minimum wage laws could be, shifted or got around, where that exploitation that the white working class in this country have suffered for years. I'm talking about pressing gangs during the transatlantic slave trade, where people were literally caught, bodied and bundled off the streets in London, in Manchester, to go and serve forcefully in the Navy on the behalf of the British Empire. I'm talking about indentured servitude of people sent to slave colonies to hard work and forced labor in Australia, say, for example. That is the contempt that many times the British government, the British state, has treated the white working class. So it's very interesting that somebody who is funded, fueled, and elevated, take Elon Musk, the product of both an incredible amount of luck, if you can call it that, an ability to fail upwards, in that he's a self-made person, gets startup capital from his father who had shares and benefited from the South African apartheid system. And this is the same Elon Musk who has also boosted accounts on X, like Tommy Robinson's. And here's the link, because that same kind of Tommy Robinson is also fueled by pro-Israel billionaires, by pro-Israel magnates and moguls, who also have Tommy Robinson, for example, attending pro-Israel marches, have him spewing hate towards Palestinians, and characterizing Palestinians and Islam in this sort of amorphous stereotype of everything that the West is opposed against. And there are more palatable images of that, and there are less palatable. So what I think is that Tommy Robinson, if you like, is strategizing towards a particular group of people. Nigel Farage is also strategizing to look at a particular group of people. And these people seem to take great pleasure in not just this moniker that they're average, they're working class, whilst in Nigel Farage's case, for example, having a career in finance and private schools, or in Tommy Robinson's case, having the money from these wealthy donors to beat legal cases that white working class people in this country are forced to either sink or swim with, because they don't have access to legal aid in a system where governments have progressively cut the amount of money available to those same working class people. But yet these people are supposedly the representatives, and they speak to the different sections of the population that they think that they can bring along with them. You know, I've heard Tommy Robinson talk about how, you know, like the National Front in France, groups trying to sanitize their image, trying to get larger and larger buy-in so that they can engineer society. The sad thing is that in many ways, because they are funded and supported by these rich groups and rich people, that people don't necessarily see that side of things. And so they don't notice that many of these people are shaping society in a way that society already is. Society already benefits some groups more than others. Society already means that the white working class do benefit in ways that, say, the Bangladeshi community doesn't. But that doesn't mean that they're not also all facing oppression in some way, shape or form. Because low wages doesn't just affect the Bangladeshi community, where over 50% of the population lives in poverty. It doesn't just affect the black community in the UK, where the poverty rate has remained at 40% for the past 25 years. It also affects the white working class. And that's what it comes to. If we were talking previously about how, you know, everything is connected, then there's two kinds of politics at play. There's the politics that looks at how, you know, there's billionaire donors and people who are elevated to the status of the person fighting on behalf of the white working class. And there's actual white working class solidarity, you know, that's shown at various situations. Hillsborough, that's shown at various situations with the Irish civil rights struggle, that's shown at various situations standing in solidarity with people against apartheid in South Africa, with Palestinians right now. Some people are spending their last £2 to get on buses and coaches to come out and show support and say to the government, we don't want arms being sold to the Israeli government. People are putting themselves on the line when it comes to striking NHS workers, many of whom have come from an immigrant background. So I think right now there's a struggle in the UK over two kinds of history. The one that recognizes the working class solidarity with the Bristol boycotts, Bristol bus boycotts, where they got desegregated, that recognizes the broad swathes of solidarity that was shown during the Vietnam War, that looks at how different groups of people are working together to try and free Palestine. And then there's the opposite number of that looks at how this one group is victimized and oppressed, and its oppression is as a result of all these other groups simply existing and being part of the British culture and British fabric. And one of them is positive, one of them is negative. One of them denigrates people, one of them uplifts people. And I think in the same way that that street I grew up in Hume, was about connecting and sharing and solidarity, that is the way forward. Because people like Tommy Robinson have come to power before and do come to power all over the world. And I think people can see the practical results of that. Like, you just need to ask, what happens when people look at one group and use them as a scapegoat? What happens when people say, oh, the reason that you don't have a house is because of immigration? Or what is it when people say, oh, the reason that crime is so high is because of these immigrant communities? An immigrant, in many ways, has become a byword to refer to black people, Asian people, Muslims. And that's what's so strange. And then another thing that's strange, just to add on to that, is that Tommy Robinson is fueled by often pro-Israel people, sees himself as pro-Israel, and at the same time spews anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about how, you know, powerful and rich Jews control the world, which is nonsense. But he's allowed to get away with that in many ways because there's a vacuum. The Labour Party, look at Clacton, from the reports that we hear, they didn't support the young black candidate in the way that they could have to put up a real challenge or fight to Nigel Farage when it came to immigration. Keir Starmer, an off-the-cuff comment refers to the Bangladeshi community as being one that is perhaps not being deported enough. There are various elements of that campaign and of the two main political parties where, for convenience, they're willing to allow people like Nigel Farage, people like Tommy Robinson to occupy more space if it means they can get efficient electoral victories like they did in the 2024 election, where on 33% of the vote, they get over 60% of the seats. And I think that one shows how the British political system is broken in some ways, but it also shows how that unwillingness to challenge these people also allows them to surge. It means that Kemi Badenoch, a woman of color, who has attacked in many ways, this idea of critical race theory, say, of teaching history in a way that looks at how different groups were oppressed differently, say, that becomes the kind of person who's the front runner to become Conservative Party leader. That Nigel Farage becomes Reform Party leader and is an MP for the first time in the House of Commons. It's how somebody like Lee Anderson, who says police officers who kick young Asian brothers in the head should get a medal, or would get a medal if he was in charge. That Tommy Robinson can come and have a massive rally on the 27th of July is part and parcel, I think, because of a failure to engage with people who are disenchanted with the regular political process, to engage with people who are fed up and tired and who are angry and upset, who have been lost and forgotten by the establishment. And there's not a politics that says to them, let's actually deal with your concerns, with your material needs. Instead, because a lot of these people, Keir Starmer can say he's from a working class background, but many people don't grow up in a two-parent household with a regular income, with a father who owns a small tool building business. For many people, working classes means something different. It means, using Uber to supplement your income. It means working 0-hour contracts. It means working double shifts. It means working day and night to get by. It means going to food banks. It means that level of poverty is rife in the UK, where there are millions of children living in poverty. But when you have a politics that says the issue is economic growth, or the issue is migration, and it doesn't deal with things like the two-child benefit cap, or the fact that billionaires have become wealthier and wealthier over time, then it leaves space for people who do want to say, actually, yes, no, it is immigration. It is these simple, tried and tested tropes about particular groups. And if it's them, then you don't have to look at the amount of money that Nigel Farage is making.
Right. For better or for worse, we currently have a Labour government, as you mentioned, Keir Starmer as our leader. Do you feel like even though he's made a lot of promises and he's gone back on these promises and things aren't feasible, and you mentioned the two-child benefit cap, do you feel like there is a possibility Keir Starmer might do good for this country?
I think the issue with that is it puts far too much on one person. In the same way that everything is connected and everybody is connected, Keir Starmer is just one man. Yes, he leads the government, he's the prime minister, but at the end of the day, he's just one person. And he only got to where he is because of the choices and actions of millions of other people. So I think if good comes, it will be perhaps in some small part because of the actions of somebody like Keir Starmer. But by and large, it will be far more because people have pushed and agitated and struggled and fought and failed and been defeated and also won at various points within the last 10, 15, 20 or 30 years. None of it can be boiled down to a single person. I was speaking to this about this the other day to a friend. And yes, I think there are elements of what a Labour government will do that will be good. Scrapping the Rwanda policy is a good thing. But if the argument that you make to the public is that we did that because of the cost and not because of the cost in, human lives, or because it's wrong or because it's against international law, then once again, I think you leave space for the Nigel Farages and Tommy Robinsons to make the argument that, you didn't go far enough, or we do need to look at something like that again. And it will come back. If small boat crossings continue, which they will, then that kind of thing will come back into the conversation. But, there'll be things, the Labour government may or may not ban arms sales to Israel. It may or not drop its opposition to the ICC request for arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu. All that will be positive stuff. But the issue is that Keir Starmer, how positive is it? if you're Henry Job's mother, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, if the UK government stops selling arms, okay, sure, that's a plus. If they back ICC arrest warrants, that's a plus. But are they going to also back the genocide case? Are they also going to implement sanctions on the Israeli government? Are they also going to implement a trade embargo? I think it's easy to talk, but I think the proof of the pudding is in the actions that people take and the decisions that they decide to take. So I think there are elements of a Labour government that most people will prefer to a Conservative government, but that doesn't mean that it's going to get better for the vast majority of people in this country. Wages have stagnated under multiple governments for the past 20 years in this country. Whether one man will change that, I very much doubt. I don't think Martin Luther King Jr. changed America by himself. I don't think Malcolm X changed America by himself. Behind all of these people, there are coalitions, the unseen coalitions, the invisible masses that do that do the work that allows anybody to be in any position of power or visibility. And it's only if those people agitate and push and work and struggle that they will get positive things out of this Labour government.
So what should people do to put pressure?
I think, I heard one trifecta the other day, and it was energize, mobilize, and organize. I come from the Kwame Ture school of thought, in that I think organization is perhaps the most powerful thing. When you look at the US and you look at the conservative movement coalescing around Donald Trump and his project, things like Project 2025, I started reading that the other day. It's a whole program. It is a plan for deportation, a plan for triangulation on positions, a plan on how to communicate certain ideas. It is a detailed schedule for implementation. And the other day, somebody, after a speech I gave, I think outside of Queen Mary's University for the encampment there, asked me, why aren't you in schools? And at the time, it stumped me. I was like, I don't know, I'm just not in schools. But it speaks to something that's a real issue for people who are not just progressives, but people who just want to see change, people who just don't want to live in a country where it's okay for hundreds of thousands of people to be homeless, or live in a country where, it's perfectly acceptable for us to sell military arms to a government that has a plausible case of genocide against it in the highest court in the world. For people who are angry and upset about those things, she was basically asking me, why are people like you, who might have a little bit of a platform, who might have a little bit of time or resources or something that you can give in that struggle, why aren't you also in an organized way on the curriculum? Why aren't you going to talk to students? Why aren't you in these spaces that for so long have been dominated by people who have a very different vision of what the UK is supposed to be? Yes, progressive people release films and whatnot and do this kind of thing, but it's not, I don't think, at the same scale and organization as those who literally, for example, have worked behind the scenes to help shift, say, the language that people on the right wing use. So shifting from talking, at one point, Conservative Party candidate is running in a seat in the 50s or 60s where the quote is, if you don't want a nigger for a neighbor, then vote Labour. And that, we've moved from that. But now the question is, if you don't want high immigration, or if you don't want these immigrant evil people attacking or destroying your daughters, is often given as the example, because there's a sexual undertone to a lot of this stuff, in that it's seen as a threat to often, white masculinity or white manhood. But the same framing is employed, but the language has changed. Removed as the N-word, and now is immigrant, or now is urban, or now is all of these bywords which still refer to the same situation. But the only way you challenge that is if you have an organizational structure that says, we're going to create our own fact-check organizations. We are going to create our own websites, our own resources, our own programs for curriculum to schools. We're going to get invited to schools to talk about X or Y issues. We're going to produce educational material. We're going to, because if it's all a battleground, people often use this language on the other side. They talk about a battleground. They talk about a struggle. They're very open and honest with the fact that they are trying to change the fabric of whatever government or country that they're in. And I think there's a lot to learn from that. There's a lot to learn from the Steve Bannons of the world, of the Tommy Robinsons, of the Jordan Petersons of the world, because they have acquired massive power. Now, there is a difference in that. I do believe, like Audre Lorde, that the master's tools won't dismantle the master's house. But that doesn't mean that you can't be smart and play with elements of the game that you have, with the infrastructure that you have. So one of the successes of people for Palestine has been, say, the use of TikTok. where everything there for pro-Palestinian content far outstrips the popularity of pro-Israeli content. And part of that has been people's creativity. Part of that has been people's ingenuity and ideas and passion. And and yet at the same time, I'm sure TikTok has investors who invest in all sorts of atrocities all over the world. So it's both playing within some of the confines of the system and learning ways to game that. Are we in schools is the question. Are we in these places? And then at the same time is how do you build alternative, better structures outside of that in the interim that people can turn to and people can find refuge in. And I think that's the twin track strategy.
While you mentioned that we should look at people like Steve Bannon and all these right-wing thinkers and these organizations as to how they go about things, I'd actually say we can actually look at people who were committed to social justice and their efforts, such as Fred Hampton, for example. A very young man was able to create all sorts of programs for his community, for example, breakfasts for underprivileged children in their communities. He's able to create a kind of a unified front between different kinds of people. So not only, I would say actually we have people within the tradition of social justice and fighting for social justice who have successfully created organizational structures that we can look to.
Oh no, I 100% agree. Fred Hampton, for better or worse, is somebody that I've drawn comparisons to in terms of speaking style. And that free breakfast program, I think, is one of the enduring legacies of the Black Panthers in America, in that, yes, Fred Hampton was assassinated, the Black Panthers disintegrated as an organization, but in many ways their ideas lived on in the fact that, say, in Chicago, where Fred Hampton was based, soon after his death, you have free breakfast programs in the state school system. And that's an example of that radical idea living far on after the person and the people who put it into practice had passed on or otherwise died. There's examples, say, for example, in Malcolm X's Organization of African Unity, or his Muslim Mosque Inc., where it became about not necessarily the views, say, of an Elijah Muhammad or the Nation of Islam, but about how you could bring people who could be of different faiths in the Organization of African Unity, but still had a broader program of liberation for people of African descent together on an international scale. And there are elements of that today. A couple of months ago, I was at a reparations conference at Parliament, where one of the speakers is part of a UN-wide international grouping of people of African descent fighting for reparations in this day and age, using and absorbing the lessons of people like Malcolm X. So I do think, that we can learn from people who, the right-wing populists, in terms of how they are approaching their messaging and how they are getting the results that they're getting. And at the same time, there is a rich history of struggle in the UK. In a speech I gave recently in Manchester, I did refer to the homegrown examples of struggle here, of Michael X, of the Sunday school program started by Black people here to offset the effects of what was described as the educationally subnormal scandal at the time, where people of African descent were often wrongly characterized as being stupid or dumb based on linguistic tests that were by and large rooted in how well you can speak English, for example, and were allocated different routes and pathways in life depending on how they scored. And it was, people, often working class people of African, Caribbean descent, Asian descent, who come together to make these Sunday schools to offset that harmful impact of the educational system in the UK. The only issue is that when Malcolm X said by any means necessary, I always took that to mean that there's not just one way, but that all the tools in the arsenal must be available to us. So if we're going to do, say, a Sunday school or get into schools, that's element one. But there must also be a plan to change the school itself and to be in the school itself. So I very much believe in break the system, challenge the system, and at the same time, in the interim, be in the system if you can, or if you're the person to be there. And if it's a battleground, then every single site of struggle, I think, must be occupied.
When mentioning all of these figures of history, I can't help but think about how they are often whitewashed, especially by liberals. And there's a saying of liberals support every right struggle except the current one. And we see that when they speak about Nelson Mandela, for example, they say, oh, where's Palestine's Nelson Mandela? They don't mention that the ANC had an armed wing, for example. Or when they speak about Martin Luther King, they don't mention that he was, for all intents and purposes, a radical socialist in some ways. So what would you say is a good way to kind of combat this whitewashing and to kind of to look not only at the past, but in the present, at the present, in a way which is truthful to what struggle is actually like?
So, well, I can give you an example. In that, say at the very beginning, October the 7th, when it came out, people were very quick to, I was one of them, to say, oh, we condemn all acts of violence and so on and so forth. And the difference was I added the but. The first video I put out was taken down by Instagram because it referred to the historical context. It was saying, yes, if you're somebody who deplores violence, then you can deplore violence. If you deplore the breaking of international law, then you can deplore that. But at the same time, that people should not be so quick to ignore over 76 years. In fact, beyond that, because the British involvement and other involvement in the area goes on far beyond that. But shouldn't be so quick to ignore how you get to any particular situation. As we were saying before, if everything is connected, then you don't just arrive, if you like, at Hamas. Hamas was founded in, say, 1980. Before that, you have a wide range of Palestinian figures, some who support political violence, some who don't, some who were socialists, some who were not, some who were Christian, some who were Muslim. And what tends to happen is if the victors write history, then Palestinian resistance in all its forms gets painted as, say, a form of terrorism, in the same way that after the fact, in 1966, over 66% of the American public disapproved of Martin Luther King Jr. But in a poll by Pew Research Center, not just 10 years ago, the result was wildly different. Over 90% of Americans have a positive view of Martin Luther King Jr. So there is this issue in that the victors tend to write history. And people who thought in one way something was good at the time tend to be denigrated and seen as a particular way. So take Galileo, the earth is not the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And for this, you can be put to death. At the same time, the slave rebellion, say, Toussaint in Haiti, people who were denigrated at the time and are now seen as revolutionary heroes. Now, this is not to say that I think any particular group, any particular armed group anywhere in the world should be painted as heroes or lions, because I don't believe in heroes in history. I don't have heroes. Because I think when you do that, when you romanticize people to a certain degree, it creates an element of worship which can be unhelpful. Every human being has their shortcomings. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, was not necessarily the most faithful human being to his spouse.
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela had a similar affliction, let's say. So in these situations, and to prevent that whitewashing of history, I think it's important that people continue to tell the stories of people from their perspective. I don't want to hear what CNN, Christine Amport has to say about Palestinians or Palestinian resistance. I want to hear it from Palestinians, because there are Palestinians who support political violence and hate Hamas. There are Palestinians who are pacifists but believe that what Hamas did was necessary in that particular context. That doesn't mean I agree with anything or anybody on any particular issue. But what it does mean is that if you want to avoid whitewashing, then you have to hear it from, if you like, the horse's mouth. I want to hear about the South African struggle from South Africans. I want to give them the space to tell their story. Or if I'm privileged enough to be in a position to get up on a platform and do a speech, I'm not going to do you any discredit or disfavor by whitewashing your history. So, for example, I have a brother in Manchester, a Palestinian brother from Raza. And at the beginning, we had our own disagreements about ceasefire or political position and so on and so forth and what line to take. And eventually we got back on the same page. But part of it was also me accepting that, yes, there are struggles that I can talk to. There are struggles in Ghana and Africa that I can speak to. There's struggles in the Black British space that I can speak to here. But it doesn't make you an authority on everything. And in order to avoid that sort of whitewashing effect, which in reality is just a form of silencing, It's just a form of saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I don't really want to talk about that part, or I want to emphasize this part I want to talk about. And so whitewashing in history tends to be an example of whoever is not necessarily the group who's being oppressed, being able to tell the story about that group who was being oppressed and about all the elements of their struggle. So one of the most, annoying things is you can go and say Wikipedia, you can go and like certain biographies of Malcolm X and they'll leave certain things out. Or in certain films, they'll leave certain people out. So in films about Martin Luther King Jr., they often leave out Kwame Ture because, he was a radical socialist and he believed in political violence. That doesn't mean that you agree with him, but it also means that the people who are pumping money from massive studios into these films tend to leave out certain figures. Or there was a member of Martin Luther King Jr.'s entourage who was a homosexual black man, and yet Bayard Rustin, and yet he was a big organizer. He was basically responsible in many ways for the March on Washington, but he is removed from the context because, in America there's a big white evangelical population. And so for them, if Martin Luther King gets elevated to this hero status, they can't associate him with anything that they might disagree with or believe is wrong. And that whitewashing of history is in the power, it's in the hands of the people who control, if you like, the means of production, the people who can produce movies, who can produce newspaper articles, who can do all these things. But in many ways that has changed. There's the democratization of, social media, of people's ability to tell their own stories. So take Motaz, say, in Gaza. He's been able to capture, in many ways, the realities, a child with his head severed, say, in a way that no CNN journalist or MSNBC or BBC person can or will talk about. But that whitewashing still continues in many ways. You still see it in the way the BBC report things. You still see it in the way even certain political figures talk about issues on the ground. It becomes sanitized and safe and easy to talk about. But when you see Henry Job, say, 355 bullets to kill a 6-year-old, or you see there was a bombing in one of the refugee camps, and there's the image seen all over the world of a father holding up, it could have been his daughter, could have been his son, but the entire head is severed, it's gone.
Yeah.
There is no way to sanitize that. There's no way to whitewash that. And when people do that, what they do is they disrespect, in my view, the people who are suffering, but also reality, facts. If that's the truth, then it needs to be told. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And in that sort of situation, to try and make it safe and easy to talk about is I think a great disservice. And so I think it comes back to that same post that got taken down was about, yes, if you deplore international law being violated, then you can't just arrive at it right now on October the 7th. If you want to deplore the taking of hostages, then by all means you should deplore that. But you can also deplore thousands of Palestinians held without trial, without charge, not just in 2023, but for over 76 years. If you're going to deplore the transatlantic slave trade, then you should deplore slave trades that happened in various shapes or forms all over the world. History is messy and complicated and ugly and dark at various times. But as soon as people start to try and whitewash it, then, well, you can see it tends to affect certain groups. It tends to silence certain people's stories. And those people, by virtue of that, become less human. Because if your story wasn't, so bad, if it wasn't so wrong or so evil, then, why do I care about your reparations? Take transatlantic slave trade as a perfect example to close this on, in that 17 billion pounds in today's money paid in reparations to the slave owner. That doesn't feature in very many history textbooks in primary school and secondary school. Most people won't learn about that until they get to university. And if they're not on a history-related course, they might never learn about it until they see it on a post on social media. But all their life, they've been told about a particular version of the end of the slave trade. Yeah. Britain abolished it. Then we started policing the waterways to make sure nobody else could sell slaves. Apart from the fact that that's ahistorical and that slavery continued in various forms in different parts of the British Empire, even after it was abolished by parliamentary statute here. It's not just that. It's the fact that it doesn't include the reparations part often in that narrative. And that's a whitewashing of history, as we're talking about. And there's no inclusion, say, of the slave rebellions, of, yes, the often violent and bloody things that enslaved people did to throw the chains off. And that gets washed out. You might disagree with parts of it. You might think parts of it are ugly. But if you leave it out, you do a disservice not just to history, but to the people who went through that. Because then all of a sudden they become these docile playthings, like the movies. Great example. If you remove the Bayard Rustins, the Kwame Tures, and the other radicals and undesirables, or if you sanitize the stories in this way or that way, then the people that we're talking about stop being human beings. They stop being complicated. They start becoming simple and easy to digest. And things don't tend to change when things are simple and easy to digest, So it's odd because in my own position, there's a difficulty because the way I approach social media and the way I approach like politics is with like this radical empathy. And at the same time, that doesn't mean I believe that you should shut down. I might not platform certain things, but it doesn't mean that I think you should shut down somebody's raw experience or somebody's raw explanation. Somebody might not use all the right words, but if you're going to say it's fine for a Nigel Farage or Tommy Robinson to refer to South Asian people with the P word and this kind of thing and refer to Islam in this way and that way, then you see that double standard emerge. Because as soon as, say, a black man wants to jump on the mic or somebody wants to talk about the mic and maybe they're swearing, maybe they're uncouth, or maybe they're not dressed in the right way, all of a sudden that becomes an issue. But when these other people are doing it, then it's not. When a police officer stamps on his head, I'm seeing people on Twitter talk about how he needs a medal, how I want to set him up in my villa and so on and so forth. But the same standard is not allowed. If a Palestinian, I'm never going to tell a Palestinian person that they shouldn't want violence, that they shouldn't want to kill X or Y person, that they shouldn't want to engage in political violence. That's not my job. My job is to say, okay, I might not agree with that in that way. Maybe this is my alternative, or maybe we could do it this way, or maybe let's talk about X, Y, or Z, or I'm going to fight with you. But it's not going to be me policing how you should go about your experience, because I haven't lost 26 members of my extended family. I don't live in what has been described as an open-air prison. I don't have that experience. So how am I going to be the one to tell you how you should relate that experience or how you should go about it? I might have my own views, but those are mine. They should never become a way to shut down somebody else's views. And even if I believe in going about it in an empathetic way, it doesn't mean that I should try and say that there are some voices that shouldn't be heard because they're the wrong kind of voices, or they're rough, or they're this, or they're that. And that's a difficult balance, because you don't necessarily want to platform, say, conspiracy theories. And at the same time, you want to have enough space for people to, talk their truth, so to speak.
You mentioned your social media post that got censored. And you also mentioned democratization of kind of viewpoints through social media. How do you walk that fine line of saying the raw truth and, in a way, actually self-censoring in order to get the message out?
So one of the most interesting things about big tech, social media, neoliberal capitalism as well, is this idea that, well, people like Tony Blair, like Margaret Thatcher, talked about how the state needs to get out of people's lives in various ways, and we can have prosperity, we can have civil liberties, and we can have a powerful free market too, where entrepreneurs, rich people can do what they like. They don't have to, as long as they pay their taxes, if they get rich, it's fine. But what that also creates at the same time is states where responsibility shifts from the state, which previously, say, in the UK on the NHS would provide people with eyeglasses and free dental care. That stuff becomes shifted to the individual. And so what tends to happen in big tech platform capitalism, as an example, Amazon, Google, Instagram, Facebook, is that the individual gets, these quote unquote free services. It's more like a barter in that we're swapping our data for this service. So it's not free in that way, but it's also not a neat, clear-cut financial exchange. But because we exist in this neoliberal paradigm where I am an individual, I'm only responsible for myself, and companies are also treated as individuals and only responsible for what they do, then if they have a policy, say on certain issues or ideas, then that's their prerogative. I can't challenge it because I'm just, an individual, and I'm free to do what I want. They're free to do what they want. And because of that burden shifting to the individual, they also have to censor themselves. The same way that I am now responsible if I get sick, and the state is less and less responsible. means that I can't rely on the goodwill of others. I have to pull myself up by the bootstraps, so to speak. But Martin Luther King often spoke about what happens. How can the man without bootstraps pull himself up by the bootstraps? How can somebody who doesn't have the wherewithal in a society, navigate that? Same way, if I am, say, in Raza right now, and there's bombs falling, and I want to record, for posterity, for the human population, the atrocities that are happening, that burden of responsibility for what I record is placed on me. It's not on Meta to tell the truth. It's not on Meta to allow people the journalistic space for free expression. It's on me to navigate a system that Meta has created. And there's almost no other way for me to get my story out, because the BBC is never going to display an image of a severed body on, the news. So I'm offered these alternative avenues of expression, but are still curtailed and controlled by those who own them, those who have the private control. Mark Zuckerberg has a special class of shares that means he exerts almost king-like dominion over these massive platforms that billions of people use. And it's billions of people in Sudan, it's billions of people in England, it's billions of people all over the world. And yet, despite this freeing up of the individual to be able to produce and express, because of this large amount of capital and because of who owns it and who gets to dictate and decide the rules, you have to operate within that paradigm. And that can be incredibly constraining, because it means that person, that Palestinian's account, can be banned if it violates certain principles or rules. It doesn't matter that they're live streaming genocide, as has been described. It doesn't matter that they're documenting what could potentially be evidence that's used in international courts of law. It doesn't matter that all these things are at play. What matters is those who control the capital, who have the private ownership rights that say, I, Mr. XYZ, own 50% of this, and you have to do what I say. So on one side, it's democratization. And yet on the other side, it's also incredible amounts of control that are very undemocratic. And I think that is because of those same neoliberal reforms that have allowed big tech and certain people, individuals, to amass so much capital and wealth. That means that, yes, they might use that, in the case of, say, Twitter, to provide the infrastructure for people to communicate. But in many ways, even that presentation of it is a lie, in that all that infrastructure is built by those same people who use it, in that your data is part of how Instagram functions, your actions are part of how it functions. So we work in many ways for Instagram, and yet we're not allowed to use it in the ways that we might otherwise use it for. And so you can see it in certain issues. So take Facebook's restraining of political content. Ostensibly, it's because people don't want to see that, and that's what they've been told. But there was never any vote given to me. There was never any referendum on that. There was never any say-so from the people who use the platform, whether or not that's how they want their experience to be. But it's decided on by these people in positions of power.
It all comes down to the bottom line.
Exactly. And it's not profitable if I want to do an advert for Coca-Cola, if next to that, advert, there's an image of a kid with the head blown off. It's just not good for profits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting with regards to ads specifically. I've recently been seeing ads, we call them Hasbara ads, or Israeli propaganda, popping up everywhere. There was actually an ad, I think, on some sort of children's videos as well. And I'd like you maybe to comment on the extent to which the Zionist apparatus has lost control over the narrative. I mean, 10 years ago, it would be unthinkable, the kind of conversations that we're having today. But, things have changed so drastically.
I believe, like Martin Luther King Jr., that the moral arc of the universe is long, but I think it bends towards justice. I think it bends towards justice partly because often things that are unfair are unsustainable. It's not true in all cases, but for many things, I think it's difficult to have a situation where things are just, bad or wrong. I think for years, the Israeli government has told people it's the most moral army in the world. If that's the case, then how are 17,000 children dead? The Israeli government has for years talked about how, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Then why are there over 63 laws that discriminate against people who are considered to be non-Jewish? For years, the Israeli government has talked about how it's a safe place for, say, like gay people or for minorities. And at the same time, various laws that apply to Israeli Jewish people don't apply to other people. Gay people can't get married in Israel.
And if you're a gay Palestinian, they'll use that against you.
Exactly, that they'll use that against you. And yet, at the same time, their own track record on human rights is documented. It's documented by Human Rights Watch. It's documented by the Israeli NGO B'Tselem. It's documented by Amnesty International, by the UN, even by courts here in the United Kingdom. It's documented. So I think what we're seeing is two things happen at the same time: demographic shifts and changes. Many people all over the world are young. In Africa, people are young. In Asia, people are young. And in the UK, young people are growing up with TikTok, with Instagram, with things that have widened the scope of what they could see. Barack Obama can talk in interviews about how when he was young, the only channels that he had access to were 4. It's a refrain that many parents have heard all over the world have said that back in their day, only 4 or 5 channels. And those 4 or 5 channels, people know this now, but during the First World War even, what could be sent from the front line back to people at home, the letters, checked. So censorship in many ways has been a real part of people's lives in a way that it is still to a degree today, but less and less. So now if a Palestinian, in a way that they couldn't 50 years ago, can show people pixel for pixel what their day-to-day life and experience is like in a way that they couldn't 50 years ago. And that has a very visceral impact on people who are seeing that for the first time. For people who are seeing it for the 90th time, it just strengthens their resolve. I've seen people on marches who are almost bedridden, but it wouldn't matter. People who are Holocaust survivors, and they're still out, and they're still fighting, and they're still strong. So what you have is that democratization that we're talking about on a mass scale for people who are younger, who are more informed, who are in many ways more political. They have era-defining issues, climate change, nuclear proliferation still, racial injustice in ways that they haven't been able to see or connect with before. Nowadays, Black Lives Matter protesters could coordinate with people in Taiwan who are trying to escape Chinese government censorship. People are sharing techniques and ideas, and this is causing, I think, a revolution in how people approach political issues, in how people are understanding Palestine, in how people can now know, for example, that there are over 50 laws that discriminate against non-Israeli personnel, that they can see how different roads are used for different peoples. They can see this with their own eyes. And I think that is the fundamental change. I don't think the Israeli government was ready in many ways for that dot-com boom. It wasn't ready in many ways for platform capitalism. It wasn't ready, and it's trying. The Israeli government has a Twitter account, it has a TikTok account, it has paid influencers and so on and so forth. But at some point, the gloss wears thin. At some point, the shine wears off. At some point, you can only ignore what you see so many times. Some people will continue to ignore it until the day that they're dead. But many live in the hope that their children won't. And I think that's the difference.
On a final note, there may be a semblance of fatigue amongst those who see all of these atrocities being filmed and shared day in and day out. Like you said, severed heads off of bodies, and dead children and the such. Now, whilst this is happening in Palestine in a very prominent way today, it's not the only way. It's not the only place where this is happening, right? As you mentioned, you've done work for Congo and Sudan and other spaces, but there is the issue of fatigue, of people see what's going on in Palestine, and it's so prominent in their heads, and it's so, not to speak of the trauma and the pain that the people in Gaza are going through, but it is quite traumatic to even look at. And some may not feel like they have the brain space to focus on all these other issues. What do you say would be a positive way to kind of tackle these issues, to connect the struggles as they are?
So I very much do believe that it's each according to their capacity, and to each according to their needs. So there are people who have very strong and urgent needs right now all over the world. And it's hard to accept that, yes, you can't save, protect, help fight for everybody all at the same time. It's impossible. But, one of the shows I watched growing up was The Boondocks. And there's a quote where Huey Freeman asks his granddad, he's tired, he's beaten up, and he's asking, what do you do when you can't do nothing, but there's nothing that you can do? And then the granddad, he takes a second, he pauses, he pans to the camera and he says, you do what you can. And I think that's the philosophy that I've employed. Some people have time, some people don't. Some people have resources, some people won't. People have access to different things. They have different talents, different abilities, and different capacities. So I think on one side, for people like me, where for whatever reason, God has blessed me with a lot of energy. And even if I didn't, I feel like as soon as you recognize what's going on, you don't have the luxury to be tired. Because tiredness is something that's not afforded to not just millions, but billions of people across the world. Billions of people live in poverty. Billions of people don't have enough food to eat. And there are acute edges of that in Gaza, in Sudan, in Congo, in homelessness here in the UK, where the average life expectancy of a homeless person on the street who's a man is 45 years old. That's the same life expectancy that it was for the average English male in the 1880s in this country. So people are going through tough things. And if everybody's different and everybody has different capacities, then as individuals, I think they have to draw from those as and when they can. There's important stuff there. I think it's important that people, get as much sleep as they can. I'm guilty of not doing that. I think it's important that people, exercise when they can. They do things to strengthen their own mind, body, and resolve and improve their mental health. If you need to go and get therapy, go and get therapy. I'm not a Jordan Peterson in that I don't think that you can't help or change the world if you don't have your own room in order, because I don't think there's any single human being who can testify and say honestly that everything in their life is perfect and okay. And I think when people do that, they tend to limit themselves. I hear from people who say, I want to get involved, but I feel like I can't speak right, or I can't do this, or I'm not so polished or eloquent, or so on and so forth. But that's nonsense. Sojourner Truth was considered to be, somebody who was ineloquent to some, and yet was one of the most eloquent speakers during the entire civil rights struggle. So a lot of that is in the eye of the beholder. And so I think as individuals, people have to draw from the capacity that they can. They have to also become stronger. Go to the gym if you can, do some exercise outside if you can, go for a walk, go for a run. They need to have, if you're spiritual, if you're religious, connect with that faith, draw strength from it, draw strength from God. Whatever you can draw strength from, I think people should draw strength from. That's on an individual level. But then collectively, organizations have a lot of work to do in terms of, broadening and changing how they work. Because unfortunately, many of the organizations that I've had the pleasure to work with, I won't name names, but many of them can be gatekeeperish. Many of them replicate the same issues that people had with organizations 50 years ago. I was talking to Andrew Feinstein the other day at one of these events that we did for people who've gone to the LSE encampment. And he was talking about how, yes, there is progress in terms of the camps that he was in Soweto and Johannesburg and whatnot, and the camps that he sees today, say, for Palestine. There's progress there. But at the same time, there's still issues. There's still, why is it on some of these marches that some of the faces that we hear from aren't Palestinian, or they're not black or brown? They are, sometimes aging Caucasians of a particular generation and worldview. But why is that the standard still? Why do we lionize, say, some individuals and not leave space for new and strong voices to come through? I think there are elements of organization and organizational structures that limit and make people lose faith and momentum in the situation. You can only go out and hear the same speech from the same person however many times. You can only hear that, we don't associate with that group because, they're going to harm our image, say, so many times. And I think in situations where there's that acute edge of suffering, as in right now, people in Sudan are starving to death. By September, 2.5 million people could be killed if nothing is done. When you have that sort of suffering, that's just raw, as in there's no arguing about it. It just is. That is the situation. Then I think a lot of this stuff has to be broken down, has to be changed, has to be shifted. There's stuff that you can do as an individual to make sure that you don't get burnt out. Exercise, spirituality, taking breaks, switching careers if you need to. There's all sorts of stuff that you can do. Eating healthily, not eating some of the processed food that comes from the massive conglomerates like the McDonald's of the world and the Starbucks of the world and so on and so forth. Supporting independent businesses, going out and volunteering, joining a local organization. There's so many things that people can do as individuals, but that's capped. And at some level, organizational structures and people with power and so on and so forth also have to recognize what they have and start to use it more effectively, start to democratize what they have. Because you can also democratize your own power. If I have, say, sway over 40,000 followers collectively, say, I can also change the way I operate so that it's not just my face that you see every time, but it's other people's faces. I can change it so that some of the issues that I've been neglected to talk about because I don't understand them or I haven't done the research about them, that I can either let somebody else who does know about it talk about it or learn myself. So yeah, I think there's a whole wide range of things that people can do.
Yes, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.